Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Geography 340 Climatology. I am Dr. Zach Hilgendorf, and in this lecture, we're going to be following up on our last lecture, looking at kind of our changing climate and how we understand that our climate is changing, and some of the things we're seeing within our climate that are driving that. In this video, we're going to be talking about really the impacts of what that changing climate means. So we ended our last video by kind of recognizing that we know anthropogenic climate change is happening because we see things like changes in the instrumental record of air temperature and ocean temperatures and in our proxy climate data record. We know that it's changing the planet by seeing things like permanent ice decreasing, sea level rising, and a more chaotic climate. Who cares? What's the big deal, right? I'm going to be dead, which is a very pessimistic view to look at, pessimistic view to kind of take. But we're going to talk about what that big deal is. So for starters, if you live in the coastal zone, you're in a rough spot. Here we can see sea level risks in the U.S. East Coast. We're looking at height above sea level on these coastal regions. If you're living in places like New Orleans, the southern edge of Florida, along anywhere on the eastern seaboard, on the Gulf of Mexico, things aren't looking too good. Same can be said for the North Sea. We're looking at places like Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, the UK, and Ireland. All of these places are expected to see some pretty drastic changes because everything's flooding. You can see this article here, this New York Times article, flooding of the coast caused by global warming has already begun. Scientists warnings that the rise of the sea would eventually imperil the United States coastlines are no longer theoretical. Go ahead and check out that article if you want to learn a bit more. We're seeing things like typhoons and hurricanes, depending on where you're at. This is Hurricane Katrina that we're looking at here, causing dramatic and widespread damage because of these low-lying coastal areas that are prone and already being impacted by things like coastal flooding and rising seas. These salt marsh areas or mangrove forests are completely at risk. You can see here fore dunes as an ecosystem and a geomorphic feature. We're looking at a fore dune here, are being eroded and are serving typically as kind of like a natural levee, but as they're getting destroyed, they're not going to be there to serve the coastal communities that live there. Places like New Orleans are obviously below sea level. Things like Hurricane Katrina were incredibly devastating to these types of regions. It's a major economic haul. We see here Miami Beach. City is about to spend $100 million over the next 2 years to raise their roads, install stormwater pumps, upgrade sewer connections in the LaGuardia and Lakeview neighborhoods in Middle Beach. So from an economic perspective, flooding and coastal flooding is a major problem. And we're spending millions, if not billions, to combat it globally. If you're in Southeast Asia, there's a couple different areas of really major concern. The first one we're going to look at is here, the Mekong Delta. So here you can see just kind of a broad overview of the Mekong. So especially down in the Delta region, very, very low lying at sea level. They're using boats to get around in some of these areas here. We can see all of these low-lying agricultural fields as well. If sea level was to rise by 20 centimeters, we would see an estimated 1 million people being impacted. If it was to rise by a half a meter, 4.7 million people. rise by 80 centimeters, 9 million people. These are conservative estimates, I'll say. We're expecting to see up to, if not more, than a meter of sea level rise in some regions. So these types of changes are going to be devastating. Next, we're going to look at the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta. You can see that here. Here's the Ganges River, India, Brahmaputra, coming over from Bangladesh into the Bay of Bengal. So down here, that's where our delta is. Similar story to the Mekong. Tons and tons. This is one of the incredibly densely populated portion of our world. People getting around in boats all over the place. Very low-lying agricultural fields again. Let's see. Here on that, sorry, in this first one here, we're looking at very heavily populated areas in the dark foresty green and actual sea level. If we were to rise a meter, 15 million people would be affected and 17,000 square kilometers of land would be submerged. 1.5 meters, 18 million people would be affected and 22,000 square kilometers of land would be submerged. And to put this in a bit more perspective, here's our estimated 2015 population density across the world. Nearly 2.5 billion people live within 100 kilometers of a coastline. The next big one, coastal erosion. Here we see a great figure from Lewandijk et al. 2018, State of the World's Beaches and Scientific Reports. This is a pretty fascinating figure because what we're seeing is about 25% of the world's sandy shorelines are eroding at about a half a meter per year. Another 25% are accreting, and about 50% or so are stable. Unfortunately, while it says, oh, it's status quo, maybe, where we're seeing the majority of that erosion is in very populated regions within our world. If we look at the kind of southeast coast of India into Bangladesh and the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta, as we talked about previously, in the Mediterranean, along the African coast, all over the western coast of the United States and Mexico, in the Gulf of Mexico, and the eastern seaboard of the United States, we're seeing significant erosion. We're also seeing it in protected marine areas as well. So it's kind of focused in areas where it's doing the majority of the damage. And it should be noted that about 75% of the world's megacities, because I haven't mentioned this before, so 10 million people or more live within the coastal regions. So between things like rising sea levels and eroding coastlines, especially in India and China and places like Los Angeles and San Francisco, these are where the majority of these impacts are going to be seen. So while this doesn't, looks like, for example, status quo is being maintained, we're seeing preferential erosion in areas where it's going to do the majority of the damage. We see it all over the place. Coastal erosion happening here in the bottom left, that's Atlantic City. Kind of looking at that same one in the top right, so that arrow kind of pointing to that house. This is Hurricane Sandy in 2012. It looked like that. So we can see incredible change happening and devastation from these low-lying coastal regions that unfortunately are building on things like spits and baymouth barriers that are depositional features, sandy depositional features that aren't static. They're very dynamic. And when you have things like large coastal storms and storm surges, they can wipe out and devastate these features. They would typically just rebuild over time. When people are on top of them, there's a problem. Here we can see Alaska's coast is vanishing one storm at a time. We see this house being destroyed by coastal erosion. This is happening in Alaska just as it's happening in San Francisco, in Washington, all over the eastern Gulf coasts, and all over the world. Extreme weather events, things like heat waves. So here we're looking at a heat wave that struck Europe in June of 2019. So we see in Tuesday, the 25th of June, we see kind of this dome of heat kind of forming in the central portion, expanding in the next day on the 26th. We are looking at departures in average temperature from 12 to 25 degrees Celsius warmer than expected. In Thursday, the 27th of June, we see it kind of shifting more towards the southwest, and then kind of going back down to what it was on Friday the 28th. But this was an incredibly dangerous thing, especially a lot of places in Europe don't have the type of air conditioning that we have, just because it's not really something they have to worry about as much. Most recently, I believe it was this past year, in the UK, were devastated by a heat wave that struck, and there's health and safety risks along with that as well, because if you've got consistent heat waves coming through and you don't have air conditioning, people who can't cool down or are prone to things like heat stroke are going to be at severe risk. Droughts. Here we see the U.S. drought monitor from December the 6th of 2022. So we see a few areas in the United States in exceptional drought. The Central Valley of California, Arkansas, and Nebraska, and Kansas, and see some areas in Oregon and Utah as well. But, in Texas. Not as bad as it has been, but we've seen some pretty historic droughts striking the United States, especially out west. And they're only expected to get worse. Intense rainstorms is another one here. Back to Minnesota. We're seeing a drastic rise in extreme rain events. So heavy rains are now more common in Minnesota and more intense than at any time on record. Long-term observation sites have seen dramatic increases in 1-inch rainfall and 3-inch rainfall events, and the size of the heaviest rainfall of the year. Since 2000, Minnesota has seen a significant uptick in devastating large area extreme rainstorms as well. Rains that historically would have been in the 98th percentile annually, the largest 2% of storms have now become more common. Climate projections indicate these big rains are going to continue. Tropical storms. Record-breaking Atlantic hurricane season draws to an end. This was in 2020. Here we can see 3 spinning around there, Sally, Paulette, and Renee. But again, because we're seeing drastic changes in our global wind and precipitation wind and moisture and pressure cycles, we're seeing changes in where and the magnitude and the frequency of these types of storms. Same thing for blizzards and cold weather outbreaks. In fact, this whole idea of these extreme weather events, these kind of out of the blue massive storms that sweep through, kind of have a name we refer to as global weirding. There's a good documentary and video on YouTube that kind of talks about it. I'll link that below. But this whole concept of these, rapid and devastating storms, or more of them, or higher magnitude, it's only going to get worse, and it's only going to be more problematic, especially for those at-risk populations and at-risk areas. So, and we're not sheltered from it here in the Midwest either. While we were talking about Minnesota as our example here, we're not that far from Minnesota. In fact, we're seeing it here as well, just not documented to the same degree that we see it in our neighbors to the west. Wildfires. is the next one. Here we see the Kincaid and campfires in California. The Mendocino, or the August Complex Fire in Mendocino in California. I've actually driven through a number of the previously burned regions when I was working on my PhD, driving to Northern California for my field work to kind of describe those landscapes, seeing them after they've burned and seeing the wreckage left by the fires from people's homes, businesses, lives. Pretty devastating. And it's unfortunately, like many things, only expected to get worse. And that a lot of that deals with U.S. forestry, or sorry, our forestry management and forestry practices for decades and decades. We've had a no burn kind of policy that leads to a lot of refuse and undergrowth that burns very well. Couple that with the droughts that we've been seeing and things like people deciding they need to have some pyrotechnic themed gender reveal party for their kid, lighting half a forest on fire. Unfortunately, it's not looking great for our long-term forests. So here we see U.S. wildfires, total area burned by year. And look, after about 2000, we see a drastic uptick. And it's not just in the US that we're seeing this. Australia, we're seeing it as well. Sweden, we're seeing it as well. Here we are in Northwest Texas, West Oklahoma, Southwest Kansas, another fire that raged through in March of 2017. But we're seeing this all over the globe. Unreliable freshwater supplies. Here we can see this is our 30-year normal precipitation, or annual precipitation for the United States. We're going to kind of focus in here on the Colorado River watershed, which you can see here, kind of bordering, I think it's 7 states. So Nebraska, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, and California, dumping out into the Gulf of California, kind of. If we look at Hoover Dam, Lake Mead, we see the kind of a bathtub ring, right? It's kind of what we call it. Lake Mead drops to record lows. This is NASA Earth Observatory. So we're seeing, and in fact, this year, I think we've broken even more records. We're seeing the weirdest things being dredged up by the exposure of all of this area that was submerged after Hoover Dam was constructed. So unfortunately, I think that's come with a fair amount of human remains, among other things like automobiles, boats, garbage in general. So kind of a unprecedented times that we're seeing with these massive reservoirs. And it's not just here in the United States, as obvious to all things here. Here we're seeing Asia's water towers, melting glaciers in the Himalaya, source of water for billions of people in India, China, and Pakistan, raise concerns about future water. University of Colorado scientists are running a $5.4 million research project for the U.S. government to study the likely impact of climate change in these regions. So that's another good video there. We see researchers, Tibetan glacial melt threatens billions. Impacts on agriculture is another big concern. Here we see a figure by Mueller and others, 2009. Climate change will depress agricultural yields in most countries in 2050, given current agricultural practices and crop varieties. If we think of the dominant crop varieties in places like the United States, corn, soy rotation, not necessarily sustainable or soil friendly in a lot of ways. But we're going to see a massive decrease in percentage change in yield from the present and 2050. So why do we see areas that are red and areas that are green? Well, if we think of kind of warming climates, it's going to make some of these regions inhospitable to growth, to agricultural production, whereas it's going to make other areas like the northern and, well, primarily here we see on the northern portion of our world where things might be inhospitable due to things like ice and snow during a majority of the year. We're going to see them being a lot more suited for growing agricultural crops. So that's why you see Canada and Northern Europe and parts of Northern Asia starting to light up green, is because they're becoming more hospitable to growing crops that they weren't able to grow before, because our warming climates are increasing their viability. Whereas the breadbasket of our country, the United States, we see a majority of it turning to that darker red color, saying it's going to be inhospitable and unviable for growing crops, or less viable for growing crops than it was in the present. So it's pretty scary if you think about it, because, you know, one, how do you account for that? And two, what's that going to mean as these areas that were previously maybe forested because they weren't hospitable for agriculture, we're going to see those areas being likely cut down to make more room to support the global population. So lots of feedbacks here, and we'll talk about positive feedbacks here in a little bit, but a lot of feedbacks from warming climates and changing conditions and what that means for us as a people. Impacts on plants and animals is the next one. So if we think about our biological species, all of them have what we call adaptations. Adaptations just mean heritable or genetic traits characterizing a species that enable members of the species to thrive and or survive in a given environmental setting. If you're a polar bear and you've watched that video on Arctic sea ice change, I wouldn't be a very positive polar bear. Unfortunately, we're seeing a massive reduction because they're suited to live in these regions that are covered by ice and snow. And as they're melting, they have to adapt, and their adapting, unfortunately, pushes them closer and closer to human contact. And as it does so, humans are going to win over the polar bear, because the polar bear will be eradicated when it's pushing into human communities. The mountain pine beetle, unfortunately, is another big one. See that here. Its range we can see currently extending here. This is a nasty one because what it does is it basically bores into trees to lay its eggs, produce its larvae, and as it does so, the larvae grow, consume the inside of the tree, and unfortunately stress it to a point of likely killing it because of how infested these trees can become. We see it here. All of that brown color are trees infested with the mountain pine beetle. We can see that here as well. And these are dead trees. And what better to serve as a source of tinder than these dead and decaying trees? So kind of a 1-2 punch with the mountain pine beetle and potential for larger burns to happen. Coral reefs, obviously the next one. Here we can see the distribution of coral reefs across the world, situated right in that, 0 to right around 20 to 30 degrees north and south latitude. So coral bleaching, if we look at this awesome graphic by NOAA, healthy coral, we see on the left there, coral and algae depend on each other to survive. They're kind of a symbiotic species. Coral have a symbiotic relationship with microscopic algae called zooxanthellae that live within their tissues. These algae are the coral's primary food source and give them their color. Stressed coral, we see this is the middle one there. If stressed, algae leaves the coral. When the symbiotic relationship becomes stressed due to the increased ocean temperatures or pollution, algae will leave the coral tissue. And then we see bleached coral in that third panel. Coral is left bleached and vulnerable. Without the algae, the coral loses its major food source, turns white or very pale, and is more susceptible to disease. What causes coral bleaching? Changes in ocean temperature, as we've talked about before, runoff and pollution, overexposure to sunlight, and extreme low tides. So it can take a vibrant reef that looks something like this. Here we can see those microscopic algae within the coral polyps that are called zooxanthellae. So we can go from this to this, or this, unfortunately. Insectborne diseases. Here we can see reported cases in Lyme disease in 1996, very heavily centered in the New England area. So these are just reported cases, obviously, so there's going to be some skew there. We see a big epicenter over in our neck of the woods too. In fact, Eau Claire is, I think, the epicenter of tick-borne disease in the state of Wisconsin. Here we see it in 2014. With warming temperatures, the ticks are able to live and not be killed off over the winter months. So typically with a lot of insect species, if you have a particularly harsh winter, you'll see a die-off of those insects because they're not able to sustain and live through the winter months. Or their eggs or larvae are not able to live through the winter months. But as our winters are becoming more mild, that's not the case. So in conjunction with expanding human populations, the insect populations are also expanding and able to kind of feed off of us even more so, which is kind of nasty. But we see a big push in places like Rochester, the Twin Cities and Hudson area, kind of that western portion of Wisconsin, eastern portion of Minnesota, and all over the eastern seaboard. All of that New England area is kind of lighting up, we see in 2014. And then positive feedbacks, and I don't mean positive as in happy, unfortunately. Positive meaning that it's something that is feeding into itself. So you have one thing that happens, and because that thing happens, this other effect is exacerbated. And because that other effect is exacerbated, the first effect is able to continue and become even stronger. Something we call climate tipping points. Now, tipping points are basically oh crap moments where we see those, and unless drastic changes happen, we're going to see kind of a positive and negative positive feedback loop for negative conditions. So here, this is a from an article by, it was Felton. I'll have that linked in the area below. So climate tipping points too risky to bet against is the name of the article. And we see them here. The Amazon rainforest, we're seeing frequent drought. That's A. In B, Arctic sea ice, we've talked about that, a reduction in area. The AMOC, or the Atlantic circulation current, is in slowdown since the 1950s. We talked about that in our ocean lecture a number of weeks back. Our boreal forests are being prone to fire and pests, and that's increasing and changing. Our coral reefs are seeing large-scale die-offs. Our Greenland ice sheet, F, is seeing an acceleration of ice loss. Our permafrost is thawing and melting away. And our Arctic, West and East Arctic, our Antarctic ice sheets are seeing an acceleration of ice loss. So some of the really, I mean, all of these are incredibly terrifying. Permafrost is a big one too, and shouldn't be underplayed at all, because with melting permafrost or thawing permafrost, you are thawing and releasing major sources of carbon that have been stored within that permafrost. And if you add more carbon dioxide from the decaying and converting carbon material, you're going to only see an exacerbation of that greenhouse effect. And it's that greenhouse effect that increases climates within that lower portion of the atmosphere. So that's where we talk about this positive feedback loop. And we can see this identified in a number of different articles, whether it's Patrick Bernard, a great paper on multiple climate change driven tipping points for coastal systems, Tim Felton, Arctic climate tipping points, or Lenton, pardon me, or Lenton and a number of others, climate tipping points too risky to bet against in nature. We're seeing this all over our world. These tipping points are kind of staring us in the face. The big deal, coastal flooding, coastal erosion, extreme weather, wildfires, unreliable freshwater sources, impacts on agriculture, plants, animals, increases in insect-borne diseases, positive feedbacks, and these climate tipping points. It's not a positive outlook. In fact, it's going to take a massive shift, not only on the government or federal or international level, but it's going to take shifts in our lives. Things that we do that increase our carbon footprint, that we could decrease it, might not seem like you can do it, but if 10 of us, 50 of us, 100 of us, thousands of us do it, we're going to see an improvement. And if we change how we live, what we eat, how we transport ourselves from place to place, making our cities more bike friendly, making our diets more climate friendly, we'll see an improvement. But it's going to take a concerted effort because things are grim. We're only expected to see things worsen. And unfortunately, it's kind of disproportionate. It's not the, first world nations that are seeing the major impacts. It's third world areas. It's places that are poorer, that can't escape it like we can, that are seeing the majority of these impacts and can't ignore it. So there's an equity issue that we need to address first. But that's where we're going to end this video, and I hope it was insightful, and we will see you in the next video, and have a great day. Thank you.